The goal of this series is to examine the ways in which the average American can improve their lives, and when determining the quality of someone's life, many argue that there's no more important factor than your health. Health is wealth, as they say, and almost no one in their right mind would accept $1 million in exchange for 20 years off their life. It shouldn't be a surprise when I say that the state of public health in America is absolutely tragic. It's hard to know where to begin with this topic, but I think what most people immediately think of is obesity, and for good reason. The US is known as the world's fattest country, with the CDC estimating an obesity rate of over 40%. That gives the US the largest population of obese people at over 135 million. They also found that 9% of Americans are severely obese, and 15% of Americans are diabetic. Not only are the rates of these diseases incredibly high, but they have increased dramatically over time. In 1960, the obesity rate was only 13.4%, compared to today's 42.8%. The severe obesity rate was under 1% and is now at 9.2%. The average American was 23 pounds heavier in the year 2000 than in the year 1960, and since then has gained another 8 pounds. All this is to say what we already know. The US obesity epidemic is completely out of control. But obesity is only one large piece of the puzzle here. Cancer deaths have risen from roughly 200,000 in 1950 to around 600,000 today, and heart disease has been America's #1 killer since the 1950s, documented as the cause of 700,000 deaths in 2020. Our psychological health is rapidly declining as well. The age-adjusted suicide rate increased 33% from 1999 to 2017. And the total number of deaths by suicide increased from 29,000 in 2000 to 46,000 in the year 2020. Most heartbreakingly, child mental health is also at an all-time low. According to a poll done by The Lancet, 1 in 12 adolescents aged 9 to 10 reported having suicidal thoughts. 1 in 12. 10-year-olds. Why would any 10-year-old be thinking about suicide? I don't even think I knew what suicide was at 10 years old. But we don't have to go to the extreme case of suicidality. Self-reported depression is also dramatically on the rise. From 1988 to 2008, the rate of antidepressant use in the United States among all ages rose 400% from 2.3% of adults to 11.4% of adults, and since 2008 rose again to 13.2%. Another startling aspect to consider is how these changes are not only present but are accepted and celebrated in mainstream culture today.
That's right, I like my girls BBW.
The social phenomenon goes by a few different names with slightly different connotations, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to refer to it as the fat acceptance movement. One of the most controversial battlegrounds for fat acceptance is within the modeling industry, where obese women featuring on the cover of prestigious magazines has caused quite a stir, like in the case of Yumi Nu, an obese woman who featured on the cover of Sports Illustrated in 2022. Prominent cultural figure Jordan Peterson was the most notable opposition of this decision by the magazine, whose remarks resulted in him being banned from Twitter. There was also Tess Holliday, whose feature on the cover of Cosmopolitan in 2018 created a similar social firestorm, with the leader of the adversarial voices being Piers Morgan. In most cases, this is how the conflict typically plays out. An obese woman, in the name of fat acceptance, is elevated to a glorified position in some medium of entertainment, and many people are angered by it, arguing that they don't deserve the spot they've received. In extreme cases, however, fat acceptance goes farther than celebrating the unhealthy and actually condemns those who are healthy.
If you work out strictly for appearance-based reasons, you are fatphobic.
Life's too short to exercise. I'm just gonna be honest. There are so many better things to do than exercise.
Fuck you if you skinny bitches, what?
The most famous example being the backlash against Adele, whose significant weight loss was made public in May of 2022. The more extreme faction of fat acceptance actively opposed her newfound healthy lifestyle and physique, with criticisms ranging from complimenting Adele makes you fatphobic to Adele herself is a disappointment to obese people everywhere. These criticisms came from voices of all magnitudes on the internet, from no-name Twitter accounts to major publications like Yahoo Lifestyle. So the great question is, what happened? Why is depression, heart disease, cancer, and especially obesity so much more prevalent now than it was in the past? Why have our attitudes towards dangerous health trends changed so much? And most importantly, how can we fix these problems? Eat less and exercise more is the short answer. But everyone knows that. Everyone knows they should be eating a little healthier and working out a little harder. Why is it that a solution so simple in theory has proven so difficult in practice? I think we can break down the American diet into two segments, fast food and store-bought food, and consider a three-pronged approach to making them healthier: education, regulation, and time. Let's start with fast food. Fast food is outrageously prominent in America. As of 2022, there was over 200,000 fast food restaurants in the United States, a number which is growing every year, and 36% of Americans eat fast food on a given day. On an average day in America, a third of the population visits a fast food restaurant. I shouldn't have to do any convincing that this is detrimental to public health, so let's apply the three-pronged approach to this problem. How can we get Americans to eat less fast food? First up is time. And the solution here is the same for both fast food and store-bought. As I discussed in the first installment of this series, improving the economy could have a tremendous impact on the quality of families. Americans spend about 50 hours a week sleeping and 50 working. That means on an average weekday, 17 of a person's 24 hours is dedicated solely to those two activities. With only 7 hours left in the day to complete household chores, drive kids to where they need to be, exercise, cook, and any unusual obligations that come up in the moment, it's often working out and cooking where people choose to cut corners. Similar to my first video addressing the domestic sector, I believe that constructing an economy in such a way that families can comfortably have only one parent working is the solution, so the other parent may focus on domestic duties like having more time to cook meals starting from whole foods rather than resorting to fast food or prepackaged food in the interest of time. Also, considering nearly half of fast food consumption happens during lunchtime, it's worth considering having regulations requiring large companies to pay workers for their lunch breaks so that workers don't feel pressure to shovel down low-quality food as fast as possible so they can get back to work. Second is education. Now, luckily when it comes to fast food, no one is under the illusion that it's healthy. So if it isn't the nutritional quality, why do people eat fast food? Well, as we just discussed, time is probably the most important factor, but education and information is a big one too, specifically financial literacy. There's a common misconception that it's cheaper to eat unhealthy food in America, a narrative that's repeated often by the most influential voices in the public sphere.
So, if you think of fast food in particular, right? There's a lot of really poor people that rely on fast food because it's very inexpensive.
The cost-effective choice is usually not the nutritionally sound one.
It may not be that consequential when out-of-touch rich people repeat this lie, but it is extremely dangerous when poor people believe their best option is actually to eat junk food. 32% of people who eat fast food report doing so because it's cheaper than the alternatives. This is not true even if you take the cheapest menu items off the dollar menu as your comparison. Let's take the McChicken for example. The prices vary by state, but the average price of a McChicken is $1.74 and contains 14 grams of protein. Let's compare this to the healthy alternative, Great Value frozen chicken breast. For $24.47, you can get a 10-pound bag of frozen chicken with each 4-ounce serving having 23 grams of protein. So if 4 ounces of pure chicken breast contains 23 grams of protein, we can calculate that the McChicken, with 14 grams of protein, contains about 2.5 ounces of chicken. This means that the McChicken offers you 1.43 ounces of chicken per dollar, while the Great Value bag offers you 6.54 ounces of chicken per dollar. Not only is it cheaper to shop at Walmart, it's not even close. Even if you take the smaller and cheaper 5 or 3 pound bags of chicken, the chicken per dollar still blows McDonald's out of the water. Keep in mind, I'm looking at the dollar menu items. The numbers get way more lopsided when you look at more expensive fast food items. Now, one might argue that I'm looking at the wrong metrics. Sure, a McChicken is only 14 grams of protein, but it's 400 calories for less than $2. Unfortunately, this is a bad train of thought. The vast majority of Americans are not counting calories, and those who are health conscious enough to do so are not eating McChickens. Secondly, Americans are obese, not starving. The last thing we need to do is try to maximize our calories per dollar. If that were our problem and poor people just needed to get the most amount of calories for as cheaply as possible, why not just serve granulated sugar by the spoonful? It's because it's not about maximizing calories. It's about maximizing nutritional value and satiety. Fast food is dripping with fats, oils, and sugars which are calorically dense, so that 400 calories McChicken will only satiate you as much as, say, 200 calories of lean chicken breast. And that doesn't even take into account how quickly you become hungry again because of the insulin spike and crash that you get. And finally, even if all that mattered was calories per dollar, it would still be cheaper to cook at home. You can get 60,000 calories worth of rice and beans for like $40. The point is, if people were more financially literate, these types of things would be common knowledge and no one would eat fast food under the false assumption that it's a more affordable option. Finally is regulation, and this is where I'll receive the most pushback because some people are indoctrinated into this religion that believes all regulation of businesses is bad. You see, some people believe that government officials who are subject to term limits will abuse their power, but the billionaires who fund those politicians won't.
Everything you're building here right now, right? Do you want the government to tell you how to do all these things and all the regulations that you got to have your electric thing this far from this and like all
the regulations like that for construction are important though. You do have to make sure that people don't do stupid shit. But make sure you don't have a power line that's near a water line. There's a lot of.
But I would put most of that on the builders though. They want to build things that are good. Now I get it.
That's not true. Listen, people
people are going to build
corners all the time. Like you have to have regulations when it comes to construction methods, or people are going to get fucked.
They cut.
Cheekiness aside, even if you're a libertarian, you should be able to acknowledge one thing. Right now, the fast food industry is damaging the country and something needs to change. With that agreed upon, let's examine what could be changed. The biggest hurdle in regulating fast food is that it's fast food. You can't regulate it into being healthy. It's not supposed to be healthy. So the focus of the regulation can't really be on changing the food, but changing the amount people buy. The simplest potential solution is an extra steep fast food tax. We have it on alcohol, we have it on tobacco, French fries aren't too far off. We may consider regulating fast food advertisements like we have for cigarettes as well. The portion sizes at these fast food companies may also be a cause for concern. In 1955, McDonald's originally only had one size for their drinks, a 7-ounce cup. Today, the small cup is almost twice that at 12 ounces, and the large is over 4 times that at 30 ounces. It's the same story for French fries, which originally came in a standard 2.4 ounce size. Today, the smallest size is 2.6 ounces, and the large is 5.9 ounces. If nothing else, it would certainly do our children some good to not have access to 30, 40 ounce sodas, but regulating portion sizes could easily be considered government overreach. Whatever the specific regulations may be, one thing is for sure. They will never come about so long as the fast food industry is able to use their massive pile of resources to lobby for whatever puppet they decide on. On the regulation front, the most important move here is fixing the election campaign laws, and similar to the economy, this will get its own video. With fast food addressed, we can move on to the more important matter, and that's the food purchased in stores and at home. As much as Americans desperately need to decrease fast food consumption, 1 in 3 Americans eating fast food every day still means that the majority of food is eaten at home. Sticking with the time, education, regulation model, we can say the time solution is essentially the same problem for fast food and groceries. As it stands currently, most Americans are eating highly processed foods at home. A study done on over 9,000 Americans in 2016 showed that 60% of the average American's calories come from ultra-processed foods. This is nutritionally equivalent to fast food. It's just as unhealthy, and the reason people do it is because it takes a lot more time to cook a meal from scratch than using processed foods. Heating up pre-packaged, highly processed foods is much more convenient. The solution for this, as we discussed, is to strengthen the economy and structure it so that families can be financially supported by one parent, giving the other more time to attend to domestic duties. Education, however, is by far the most important area to improve on when it comes to fixing the American diet. I think nutrition might be one of the least understood topics when it comes to public health. In the US, only 25% of medical schools had a designated course in nutrition as of 2010, and on average, US medical schools only offer 19.6 hours of nutrition education across 4 years, which amounts to less than 1% of total lecture hours. In the general population, there is so much conflicting information about what diet is the healthiest that it seems like there's no point in even beginning to research the topic. Some people say meat is bad for you, others argue carnivore is the best diet, others say keto is the only way, low fat, low sugar, low this, low that. It's almost impossible to know who to trust. Really, the basics of a good diet are pretty simple and should be understood by everyone in the general population. There are 3 macronutrients, carbs, fat, and protein, which contain calories, and there are 23 vitamins and minerals, also called micronutrients, which do not contain calories. Your body needs macro and micronutrients for proper physiological function. For the most part, in order to have a healthy diet, all you have to do is make sure you're digesting the proper amount of these macro and micronutrients while minimizing everything else. This is why so many different diet fads are even able to get popular in the first place, because as long as you can get all these nutrients, the diet can work for you. The problem is that government entities and corporations alike throw all nuance out the window and instead take the approach of foods being bad or good. Don't get me wrong, there are foods that are straight up bad for you, but these guidelines do not, especially in the past, accurately reflect reality. One of the earliest all-encompassing dietary guidelines given to the American public was the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Basic 7 food groups in the 1940s. Considering the time period, it's actually not bad advice. They roughly split up fruits and vegetables into 3 categories: citrus, leafy, and starchy. And the last 4 categories are meat, dairy, grains, and butter. Far from perfect, for sure, but it does encourage a wide variety of foods which will get you all the different micronutrients that you need, and it also doesn't specify a quantity of each food group you're supposed to eat, a trend that becomes strong in later years. They simply recommended a healthy variety of foods while maintaining the balance between calories in and calories out. After the war ended, however, things changed pretty significantly. The USDA switched their 7 food groups to 4: milk, meat, fruits and vegetables, and grains. This is where we start to see the formation of some long-lasting trends. Unlike the guidelines in the previous decade, this set of guidelines included servings. You were advised to eat 4 servings each of grains and fruits, 2 servings of meat, and milk varied by group. Compared to the guidelines from the decade prior, this new diet seems to have much less variety, less balanced quantities, and favors grain and milk more heavily than it did before. You see, during the war effort in the 40s, the US was heavily invested in research to produce food rations for soldiers that could be preserved and sent overseas. This was the beginning of the boom in production of processed food, but at the time, all that food was going towards winning the war. After the war ended, this process of cheaply creating preserved food was now mastered, but there was no war to utilize this mastery effectively, and this is when highly processed food really started flooding into American kitchens. But there was a problem with all this processed food popping up out of nowhere. People were getting unhealthy. More specifically, heart disease was on the rise, and the American public panic really started to spill over when President Eisenhower had a heart attack in 1955. Luckily for us, the American Heart Association came out with its set of guidelines in 1961 with the answer to the heart disease problem. They declared that saturated fat consumption was a major contributor to heart disease, and that switching to polyunsaturated fats like vegetable oils were the ideal replacement. But why? We know today that consuming vegetable oils are detrimental to your health, especially when they're heated or exposed to light for long periods of time. So why would the AHA recommend we consume that? Well, coincidentally, the American Heart Association was financially built by Procter & Gamble, the creators of Crisco cooking oil. The AHA started as a very small organization without much influence, but in 1948, Procter & Gamble donated $1.7 million to the American Heart Association, and wouldn't you know it, that same year, the AHA significantly reorganized the institution and awarded its first ever research grant. This is all publicly documented by the AHA itself, although it suspiciously fails to mention where it received this influx of cash from. Regardless, 1961 saw the AHA and the influential Dr. Ansel Keys begin the crusade on saturated fat, and in turn, we saw the consumption of cooking oils begin to skyrocket in the 1960s. The dietary guidelines continued to evolve, or arguably devolve. In 1977, the United States Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, also known as the McGovern Committee after Chairman George McGovern, published the report Dietary Goals for the United States. This report laid out dietary goals for the American public and reinforced shifting the blame to fat consumption for poor health, while simultaneously recommending that 60% of Americans' calories come from carbohydrates. Similar to the AHA in the previous decade, however, it was found that there was some shady business going on when Mark Hegsted, one of the 4 scientists who advised the committee, was uncovered to have taken bribes from the sugar industry to downplay the dangers of sugar and shift the blame to fat. The controversy associated with the McGovern report led to the USDA and HHS releasing what was the first official edition of the DGAs, Dietary Guidelines for Americans, where we would continue the trend of these guidelines becoming less specific and less helpful. This guideline just makes blanket statements like don't eat too much sugar and maintain a healthy weight, without ever defining what constitutes as meeting the guidelines for these things. The USDA DGAs never really gained much traction, and it wasn't until 1992 that the USDA really struck gold again. In 1992, the USDA introduced the food pyramid for the first time, which is far and away the most well-known and impactful dietary guideline ever given to the American public. The pyramid presented the food groups in a hierarchical way based on the number of daily recommended servings. Grains were at the bottom, accounting for an upper limit of 11 servings, vegetables at 5, fruit at 4, meat and dairy each at 3, and fats, oils, and sugars to be as little as possible. The iteration of this dietary advice lasted 13 years and to this day is the most well-known of any US dietary guideline ever given. So you might be thinking that such an important publication by the USDA would be free from bad science, outside influence, and general corruption, unlike the other guidelines we've discussed so far. And you'd be wrong. Ignoring the bad science and contradictions within the pyramid, there was actually such intense lobbying from the meat and dairy industries that the original release of the food pyramid was moved a year back, from 1991 to 1992. There was also successful pressure from the grain and dairy industry that got the USDA to not clarify a distinction between whole grains and low-processed dairy to their refined and highly processed counterparts. From the McGovern report recommending 60% of our calories come from grain in the 70s, to the food pyramid recommending 11 servings of grains a day in the 90s, it's no wonder that grain consumption in America increased nearly 30% from 1970 to 2010, and that in 2010, over 46% of our calories came from fats, oils, and grains. Overall, I think you get the picture. For nearly half a century, the American public has been flooded with bad dietary information under the influence of different competing food industries and government interests, leading to a diet incredibly high in processed foods that has caused the population to become unhealthy. So how do we fix nutritional education? How on earth do we arm the populace with all the information that I've laid out? Well, truly, we don't have to. While it may be interesting or beneficial for people to know the entire history of nutritional guidelines in America, it really just matters that the new guidelines we give are good ones. I think that we can improve people's shopping habits considerably if we focus our dietary recommendations on a few key points. 1. Balance your diet in a way that satisfies all your macro and micronutrient requirements. And 2. Explain the importance of prioritizing whole foods over processed foods. This methodology kind of blends with the regulation prong of my approach, so I'll combine them. Firstly, education starts in school. As it stands, health class in high school is nothing more than a formality. Other than STDs, I don't think anything of importance is covered in high school health class in America. I'll go more in depth in the chapter in the education sector, but really, we need to teach kids what a healthy diet is while they're in school to establish lifelong habits. Nextly, we need to help the public identify bad foods. In the section on fast food, I likened junk food to alcohol and cigarettes, and I'll do the same here. I think if we start requiring companies to put warning labels on unhealthy foods in the supermarkets, it may wake Americans up to the fact that the food they're buying may not be as healthy as they think it is. I thought of this for the first time when I was eating Takis, and for whatever reason the bag I had was supposed to have been shipped to Mexico but ended up in the US. Mexican Takis have a warning label on them, denoting that they are an unhealthy food. I thought maybe the US could do something along the same vein. Similar to how we have different logos and colors for hazardous chemicals, we could do the same for foods, with specific colors and logos to denote specific nutritional concerns, whether it be excessively high sodium, high fructose corn syrup, ultra-calorie dense, etc. Not everyone has the time to learn all the nuances of nutritional red flags, And even if they do, few people read the nutrition label and even less read the list of ingredients. So requiring hazardous nutrition labels like we do with hazardous chemicals could help people get the information they need to make a decision quickly and efficiently. Diet and nutrition is not the only source of the American health crisis. We have a huge problem with endocrine-disrupting chemicals like pesticides, phytoestrogens, phthalates, and bisphenols found in our plastics, hygiene and beauty products, clothes, food, water, and even air. We have a culture that makes living a non-sedentary lifestyle increasingly difficult with every advancements of digital technology. And we have a medical system chained by big pharma that is not only criminally overpriced compared to other developed nations, but focuses care around injecting people with drugs rather than teaching and promoting healthy habits. But I think diet is the first and by far most important step because it helps in all these other areas. When someone's diet is better, their body is more able to flush out those toxic chemicals. They have more energy to exercise, and they're less likely to need medical attention in the first place. I believe strengthening the economy will allow families to survive with only one parent working, which frees up time for the other to focus on making nutritious meals rather than TV dinners or fast food. I believe that by educating people to the financial realities of eating fast food and the nutritional realities of eating processed food, that we can encourage a society of people who are more selective at the grocery store. And I believe enforcing a higher level of transparency on the industry giants that produce most of our food will result both in more healthy food being created and less toxic food being consumed. This issue is of the utmost importance. If you agree with my analysis, please share this with anyone who will listen. And if you don't, let your voice be heard. We must exchange ideas and repair the American diet. The future of our population and our country depend on it.